What I really need from my law firm is someone who can provide my staff training so we actually can stay out of trouble.
I really just want somebody who's going to aggressively fight for me in court. Is that too much to ask?
When you have property management problems, we have your solutions. This is the Zona Law Group podcast with the experienced attorneys from Zona Law.
Welcome back to the Zona Law podcast. I am Mark Zinman, and I am very excited to introduce a new attorney here, so I'll defer to him, please.
Morning, everybody. My name is Spencer Dickson.
You guys, I am super excited for this podcast today. We're covering an important subject of domestic violence and, protecting victims of domestic violence. And two, we're introducing Spencer Dickson, which is very exciting for me.
Bold of you guys to have me on the podcast on my very first day on the job. Who knows what's going to come out of my mouth? Ready to go and excited.
Yeah, I guess we could have probably pretended like this was recorded months after you worked here, but how many hours have you been with the firm, by the way?
Let's see. I think about two hours now, ready to roll. So
it seems like he should know the stuff already. But Spencer's actually been practicing in this area and in other areas as well for years, correct? Why don't you tell... We will jump, just so everybody knows, we will jump into the domestic violence and kind of explain your obligations to landlords and residents' rights as well. But it's really important you guys get to know who you're working with here. So,
sure. I went to law school at ASU, been in the Valley for about 13 years now. And right out of law school, started working with a partner of mine who was running his own shop before. So we actually let him go and run for mayor of Mesa. He went off to run the city, and I kind of took the helm at the law firm. So really for the past 10 years or so, I've been essentially handling all cases from beginning to finish, and that includes even some complex litigation matters where we're doing discovery, we're filing motions with the court, handling even more complex cases than just your regular run-of-the-mill eviction action.
Okay, so you do both though, right? You've done the evictions and the complex litigation as well?
That's right.
What kind of stuff you like doing?
Oh, sure. I mean, sometimes it's good to have a case that kind of has a beginning and an end that's real quick. It ends in about a week or so. But on the other hand, it is nice to have some of those cases where you're in a battle for a long time, and those are fun to handle. They're unique challenges, and it's a way to kind of exercise your mind and kind of use some of the skills that you learned in law school and as a lawyer for the past few years.
That's awesome, and that's why we're so excited to have you at Zona Law. For me, it was always a natural fit between the two. Your practice is very similar to ours. We approach it the same way, right? The professionalism, the quality of legal representation that we can bring to our clients.
Yeah, and in fact, I mean, we've this is official now that we're working together, and I'm in the office. But I've relied on you in the past to cover cases for me, and we've done vice versa. So to some extent, we've been working together for some years now.
Yeah, that's great. The fact that he shows up wearing this also, and I don't have to worry about the professionalism, is always a good sign for me. Last thing before we jump into the subject matter. Outside life, what do we need to know about Spencer Dickson outside the office?
There you go. I born and raised in McLean, Virginia. I met a girl in college. She was from Arizona, and she took me to Arizona for the first time in February. So
strategic.
I feel like I was kind of tricked into it, but haven't looked back since. I've been here in the Valley for a long time. Love it. We've got 3 beautiful kids. They're all 3 in elementary school right now, so we've got them all in one school. It's probably the last time that'll happen. We'll send them off to middle school and high school coming up.
That's got to be busy.
We're doing okay. We're doing great. Busy but fun. I like to, I'm a bit of an endurance athlete. I like to swim, bike, and run. I've done a few marathons and getting ready for a few races coming up.
I actually forgot that about you. I knew that years ago, and it kind of just fell off my radar. And now that makes me feel really lazy and reminds me I better sit up for my posture so I look a little better on camera. All right. Well, honestly, for all of our clients, we're so excited for Spencer to join us. I mean, this is just truly a natural fit between the firms, and it allows us to really continue to provide the best level of service for our clients. So on behalf of all of us, we're so excited you're here.
I'd say the same. It's honestly a privilege. It's going to be really great. I'm excited to be working with the firm.
Who doesn't want to do a legal podcast?
Come on.
So with that, let's jump in. A couple weeks back, we sent out a newsletter, as we always do, about a subject that's come up a lot lately, which is domestic violence. There's a statute on it here, ARS 33-13-18. And obviously, you guys know us. We don't need to bore you with the statutes. But with that, we got a lot of requests from managers to say, okay, how about you do a podcast on that and kind of walk through it? So that's what we're going to do today. Like always, try and keep it brief and really hit you on the points that you need to know as a property manager or owner. So the general concept behind the statute is you don't want to victimize a victim. if somebody's a victim of domestic violence, you want to work with them to either get out of their lease or whatever their other rights are, including, as we'll discuss, change the locks on the unit so that they're not being victimized by the property after something horrible has already happened in their life. And so that's the general connotation, is you want to work with your residents with this statute. It's a technical statute, but you have the practical implications of really working with people. So what are the two real remedies a person has when, we'll get into the details of how, but if somebody says they're a victim of domestic violence, what are their general rights under the statute?
Yeah. And again, that's perfect. It's about protecting that victim. Their rights are, one, to terminate the lease and simply leave and say, we're going to agree on a mutually agreed upon date sometime in the future within the next 30 days to vacate. Their second remedy is to have the landlord change the locks. And those two, either method is designed to protect this victim after something horrible has happened.
Yeah, and under the statute, the statute actually says the tenant's supposed to pay for the change of the locks. A lot of landlords just do it because they use their own system anyways. Frankly, with a lot of smart locks, they just change the code. And then you don't give the aggressor access to that unit unless they have come with a police escort. Because technically under whatever, depending on where they qualify from, the aggressor's not even supposed to be returning to the property anyways.
There may be an order of protection that's in place that it does exactly that, prohibits that aggressor, that perpetrator of domestic violence, from returning.
Yeah, and it's important to note this statute actually says that if there's a sexual assault in the unit as well, that person can also invoke those same rights. But almost never do we really see that issue come up as much. It's much more the domestic violence, so that's what we're going to focus on here today. So, Spencer, again, you've been here 2 hours. This is good stuff to throw you under the bus. So what qualifies a person as a victim of domestic violence? Not the proof yet, but just like the general concept.
Yeah. So domestic violence is violence that happens, we'll just say it, in a domestic setting, which would include either a sexual relationship, a familial relationship, or people that live together. So what we're thinking is it's a boyfriend-girlfriend and violence that takes place within that relationship. And again, like you mentioned, if sexual assault happens within the property, then that also triggers some of the protections of the statute. But again, most of the time what that looks like is two people that live together are in a relationship, or it's husband and wife, maybe even,
co-parenting is a big thing.
Exactly. Then this statute applies.
Yeah, and that's an important thing for people to, when I get this question a lot, is managers say, well, the victim is my resident, but the aggressor that caused this problem isn't my resident. Do I even need to do anything? And the answer is yes, because it focuses on the status of the victim, not where the aggressor is from. And so even if the victim is your resident and, their former sexual partner took action against them, they can be released because they were your resident. And the purpose obviously is so they can move somewhere else, protect them and for their safety. So switching from that then, what is the proof under the statute? Because that's always the first question that managers come to us with.
Yeah, one of two things that the statute mentions that the victim can provide is, one, a police report, and the statute says that the police report just needs to say that the victim made a report to the police. And so I guess
that they're a victim of domestic violence.
They made a report that the domestic violence took place and they were the victim. Yes, absolutely. And the other item that they might provide is an order of protection. Order of protection sort of necessarily involves that relationship and that closeness. You distinguish an order of protection from, say, an injunction against harassment. An injunction against harassment wouldn't qualify under the statute. An injunction against harassment is if you got a neighbor that's being loud, you got somebody that's annoying you, somebody that's making phone calls to you. That's an injunction against harassment. That doesn't count here. Order of protection handles what we're talking about here: violence in the home, that sort of thing. Yeah,
and I always think of those two because they're kind of related. But domestic violence is a higher level. As Spencer said, you have an injunction against harassment could be that your neighbor is bothering you and they're calling you and texting you. That's an injunction against harassment. If you have that level, plus you have that familial relationship or the sexual relationship, that's when it raises to a domestic violence. So it's almost a different threshold because you have additional elements. So people may bring in injunctions against harassment. That's not enough to get out of the lease, but it is if they bring in an order of protection. So the two things then is the police report you mentioned and
or an OP,
the order of protection. Okay, so now we got the what, then the question is the when. So when do these have to occur?
Yeah, and I mean the statute sort of anticipates that someone is going to raise this issue with their property manager as soon as it happens in order to invoke the protections. I guess the fear is you have someone who says, well, I'm not paying rent, but by the way, I was the victim of domestic violence a year ago. The statute says, I'm sorry, that's too late. in order to invoke these protections. The statute requires that they give notice, the victim gives notice to their landlord or property manager within 30 days of the order of protection issuing or that police report.
Yeah. And so, and I have seen it. You'd be surprised. I mean, again, with so many units out there, it's just eventually you kind of see everything. I have seen cases, what Spencer's mentioning, where somebody brings it up 9 months later. And I tell clients, I understand the sympathy, but you have to follow the law so you don't run into fair housing issues. The law says it has to occur within the 30 days. You follow that law unless there's some other reason exception. And even cases where a person may have an older police report or an older OP, they then, it's possible, have a new issue come up. Then they just run out, get a new police report showing that that's a continuing issue, and then they would qualify under the statute. It's not to play technical games, but you have to have that consistency to comply with fair housing. So the incident had to have occurred within the past 30 days. When does the person get released or able to invoke their rights?
Well, the statute says that they can deliver that report to the property manager, and then they agree on a move-out date. They agree on a termination date. The timeline in the statute, is it 30 or 60 days?
It's 30 days out.
Yep.
It says up to 30 days the person can be responsible for rent. So that's kind of the standard default of how far you go out. Because, again, consistency is key for what you're looking to do. What happens... I mean, imagine you have a victim in domestic violence that's in a room, has 2 other roommates. What happens to the other roommates if the victim wants to leave?
Yeah. So you keep reading down further in that statute. It says that the lease is terminated as to all of the occupants. Okay. I mean, obviously, if I know we mentioned the scenario where the aggressor is not on the lease. Obviously, if that person is on the lease is terminated as to that person. He doesn't get to stay.
So you have to. I mean, well, it's an important thing to bring up. So, right, you have potentially have to do an immediate against the aggressor if they are your resident. Even though, I mean, under the OP or most likely the police report, they're not even allowed to be near the unit anyways, right?
So that's exactly right. They may not be allowed to return, but I'm agreeing with you. I think it's good advice to secure that judgment and to have at least the apartment secure the right to say, hey, this person did this wrong act. We want a judgment against him. We want to make doubly sure that he doesn't return. We were talking about perhaps if there's an innocent roommate, right? We have an aggressor, a victim, and then other occupants of the property. The statute says the lease is terminated as to them also, so maybe they're collateral damage in all this. The lease is terminated. The statute says that, hey, if the parties want to, if everyone is agreeing and they want to reestablish the lease with those uninvolved innocent parties, then everyone is free to enter into that contract or not as they choose.
Yeah, but the lease terminates as to the roommates. They'd have to do the deposit accounting. People would have to check the damage to make sure that the victim's getting their portion of the deposit they're entitled to, and then, requalify and start a new lease with the people that want to stay. And that way you can keep people, but also properly make sure you're following the law as well. And then we kind of touched on as well, but really, with the aggressor, what's your general suggestion?
Well,
if they're on the lease, I apologize.
Again, the suggestion is, even though that order of protection may say that they're not allowed to return to the property, still file that eviction action. And if they've committed domestic violence in the property, then that's grounds for an immediate termination of the lease. That's a material and irreparable breach.
Yeah, and it's a question we always get is like, oh, well, can we just remove them? There's no such thing under the law in the Landlord-Tenant Act just to remove somebody from a lease. You have to do an eviction, you have to do a termination, or a mutual release. And people ask that a lot. I generally don't suggest the mutual release with an aggressor, though, because they're financially liable. They're the reason all of this is happening. You want to keep them liable. It's the victim you want to protect, and the victim you want to release from the liability so they can obviously go find a new place to move on to.
And again, any of the financial consequences for the domestic violence, I mean, I'm imagining property damage and things like that, all that aside, but any liability the landlord suffers, any damage the landlord suffers because of this domestic violence, the aggressor is on the hook for that. The aggressor is liable to the landlord for that.
So it's really important just think about that theme about working with your residents on these things. It's really trying to protect the people who have been victimized already. And as a first podcast for you, Spencer, I'm sorry we went down a little bit of a somber note in terms of subject, but it's really an important subject for managers to understand.
It's a tough subject. Sorry, hey, I'll start out with a difficult topic, no problem at all. It's one that we get calls on a lot, and this is something we've gone over some of the bullet points. Please don't hesitate to reach out. This is something where there are a lot of moving parts here, and it's something that I field questions about all the time. And so it's something that you ought to consult a lawyer about if you're dealing with these issues, and we'd be happy to help.
Excellent. And again, Spencer, welcome aboard. We're so excited to have you at Zona Law. Do me a favor, though. when your kids watch this podcast, next time you come back, tell us what the feedback is from the kids.
You got it.
My kids make fun of me all the time. So, you guys, until next time, we'll see you on the Zona Law podcast.